Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Coffee and Hardtack. My name is Dloug Dammann. I'm the educational coordinator at the Civil War Museum. With me today is author Mark Flotow. Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure, Doug. I really appreciate you having this format of coffee and hardtack, sort of a play on John Billings' classic Civil War book. I've watched some of the other programs, and it's really informative, and it's just perfect here during a pandemic.
Well, thanks, Mark, for those kind words. And, we were looking for a way to transition to stay relevant while we couldn't do in-person programming. And, Jen and I came up with these programs. To her credit, it was her idea. I've kind of taken it over as she has moved down by you in Springfield at the Illinois State Museum. So it's been a lot of fun to keep it going. For those of you who are maybe joining us for the first time, we've done a series of these since last spring, and we try to keep the conversation somewhat, just like you would if you were encountering one of us at a coffee shop. We're just having a conversation. We've had such good luck talking with authors and teachers and public historians, people who are doing really good and new and interesting work in the Civil War field. And Mark, we're so glad to have you with us today. I do want to give your bio here for those of us who are joining us. Mark Flotow is the retired director for the Illinois Center for Health Statistics and is a former president of the National Association for Public Health Statistics and Informational Systems. He's an adjunct research associate in anthropology at the Illinois State Museum in Springfield, and as a volunteer interviewer with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library's Oral History Program. Mark has published articles about Illinois Civil War soldiers and Illinois heritage, and has given many presentations on the topic. His latest book was recently published by Southern Illinois University Press and is entitled, there you go, In Their Letters, in Their Words, Illinois Civil War Soldiers Write Home. And that's what we were going to talk about today. So Mark, again, welcome. And thank you so much for coming out.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking about the book, something I guess I enjoy doing.
Yeah. So about the book, where did your initial concept, where did the idea for the book come from?
So if it had been like 10 years ago and you were able to see into the future and say to me, Mark, I'm looking forward to your book coming out on Illinois Civil War soldiers, in their letters, in their words, I would have said, I think you've got me mixed up with somebody, because I had absolutely no intention of writing any kind of book or about the Civil War. But then the sesquicentennial of the Civil War happened, and that sort of piqued my interest. And there were local presentations, various commemorations about the Civil War. So I got interested in that, and I thought, I want to add something to the commemorative side of it. So since I'm also a local poet, you know what my email address is, it's Springfield Poet. I thought I would try to write a series of poems about the war that people that lived at that time 150 years prior would feel comfortable reading, would understand what they're about, as if they were written at that time. And it was not going to be just soldiers. It was also about the citizens and other people that experienced either directly or indirectly the impact of the Civil War. So I ended up doing that. I ended up being part of one of the last sesquicentennial presentations that was done by Mark Depew, who's the military historian at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. And he said, why don't we read some of your poetry as part of the last one about the capture of Richmond and Appomattox Courthouse. And I remember reading poetry in front of an audience of about 300. And I said, as a local poet, this is as good as it's going to get. I turned the whole thing into a poster board and had done some other presentations. It ended up being on display for a couple months in the atrium of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And I thought, wow, that's terrific. But to do that, to get into the minds of people at that time, I went over to manuscripts at the ALPL, the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, and started to read soldiers' letters before I started writing the poems. And I started going through to see, look at some of the collections, and they have about 1,000 Civil War era collections. Not all of them have personal letters in them, but most of them do. And so I sat down and just wrote down the way they expressed themselves, just various topics that caught my attention. And from that, poem ideas started to come to me. And as a matter of fact, the title of my book, In Their Letters, In Their Words, is actually one of the titles of the poems that I created, which was a mashup of about 12 different Illinois soldiers. And I took parts of it and made what I called an archetypical letter that I took, parts of. So I made it sort of a found poem kind of thing. And so that's ultimately where the title of the book came from. But when I was done with the poetry project, I thought, oh, well, okay, that was great. But I kept reading more soldiers' letters. And it was finally at one point, I thought, when I started the project with the poetry, I was looking for a book like this one, where it was quotations from letters. It would have saved me months of time. So I finally realized there was sort of a need for this book. And that's when I decided I'm going to start taking all of these transcriptions that I've been doing. And at about that time, when I started thinking about the book, I started a project that ended up being 46 different essays. Every Friday, I had a group of colleagues and people that were completely uninterested in the Civil War. And I would say, here is something that I am reading about among the various letters. This is what they said about the Emancipation Proclamation. Here are things that soldiers wrote about what guard duty was like. So some things were, sort of topics people recognized, and other things, sort of mundane, but it was all part of the soldier subculture. And I ended up doing that for 46 weeks. So I refer to it as the 46 essays. But I was doing those thematically based on what soldiers wrote about. So if it was about camp life, I would have a few essays on camp life. Well, those ended up sort of coalescing into sections and ultimately chapters in the book. So that's where the book ultimately came from.
Yeah, I think you wrote on your website that the soldiers themselves determined how you arrange the content of your book. It just in that same story that you wrote, these major themes started to emerge from the letter collections that you had seen, and then you kind of broke down the book by those themes. Can you talk about a few of the other themes that you hit on in the book?
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to. One of the reasons I wanted to kind of do it this way with these themes was I wanted to take a very inductive approach, that is from the ground up. So from the soldier's perspective up, in trying to understand the Civil War. As I said before, at that time, I did not have much of a Civil War background. So I did not have preconceived of ideas of what to look for. Themes that, I better read something about, XYZ because I'm expecting that. I really wasn't. So that's how they kind of came together. And they have, as I said, they have hundreds of collections, about 1,000 at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And so I ended up literally reading these thousands of letters, and then I could start to see how they coalesced and put them together. So it was me going in at least 3 or 4 times a week into manuscripts right there, and then at night do transcriptions. So I could have things that were word searchable, so that when I thought about Emancipation Proclamation, I could type that in and find, all those things that kind of came together. I did go to some other places to look at letters. I went to the Logan Museum. I went to Southern Illinois University. Ultimately, I did not use other letter collections. After a while, I realized there was great representation of geography just right there in my town of Springfield at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And after a while, I started to become conscious of that. I said, am I skipping areas geographically, or am I skipping areas of the military service during the Civil War? And I didn't necessarily have to look to kind of round it out, but then I started having this sort of conscious idea that I wanted to have as much as possible represented of the various experiences of Illinois soldiers. So geography ended up being one of those. So I ended up just at the ALPL. So, Microsoft would say, somebody says, oh, the way your software works, this is sort of a bug. And then Microsoft comes back and says, no, that's actually a feature of the program. So when somebody says, why didn't you go up to Chicago and there's all these vast resources here or at this university or so on? I wanted to make something that was kind of one-stop shopping for people that if they wanted to read more, if they wanted to go to this collection, it's free to the public. They can do exactly as I did and be able to duplicate or read further than I did and come to their own conclusions and opinions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you and I were talking before we started recording about the state of Illinois. I grew up in Illinois. It's 7 miles from the Wisconsin border. And I don't think that people who aren't from Illinois realize how long of a state Illinois is geographically. You mentioned about 400 miles from, extreme northern Illinois all the way down to Cairo at the southern end. And, how the state was settled from south to north, maybe below Springfield. And then northern Illinois has more of your classic, immigrants coming from maybe New York State or New England or Germany, foreign immigrants. So there's a real different flavor in Illinois, a real separation from north to south. Did you get that sense, and did patterns start to emerge in the letter collections that you considered, that you could see like, well, Southern Illinois soldiers typically felt this way about why they went in to serve, or they had decided opinions about Lincoln that were different than Northern Illinois soldiers? Did any of that really develop that you found?
Yeah, I definitely got somewhat of a sense of that. They sometimes did write about politics and parties, but it was rather actually infrequently that they actually, talked about the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or, those kinds of things. It turns out that really the most common denominator related to politics was when something was going on or being discussed, Illinois soldiers would think about it in terms of, okay, how does this relate to the length of the war? And how much sooner can I get back home because of that? So for the Emancipation Proclamation, for example, a lot of soldiers, not exactly irrespective of geography within Illinois, but a lot of soldiers saw it as a practical measure that if we can get to sort of deprive the Confederacy of one of its infrastructure resources, then maybe the war would be shorter. On the other hand, there are also Illinois soldiers who said, you know what? This is kind of what the war is about, and the Confederates are going to fight all the harder. This is going to become a hard war. No holds barred at that point. Do we regret that? This could really drag on a long time. So there was all these different opinions. And I actually did a paper on that very thing about opinions geographically and on some other dimensions a couple of years ago at the Conference on Illinois History, where I looked at about, it was like 25, maybe to 30 different soldiers who wrote something about the Emancipation Proclamation, whether they saw it as a practical measure of the war or whether they saw it as a social measure sort of thing.
You talked about in again on your website, your the questions that you kind of asked yourself when you put this together, talking about reading other people's letters and making that recognition that, you know, these letters were never written for other people's eyes, other than the person that it was addressed to. You know, some soldiers, you feel, get the sense that they were almost embedded correspondents for a local newspaper, and they might have known that what they were writing home or writing to that newspaper was meant to be published in the local paper. Um, these were never meant to be seen outside of the intended party. Do you feel that that gives those letters more of an honest viewpoint of really what they're feeling at that time? And if so, how so? And did you ever kind of feel like an uninvited guest, I guess, at any point when you were doing, because I know when you use these primary sources as letters are such a rich source for historians, and you almost kind of feel a little bit guilty that you're invading maybe someone's personal space a little bit when you're doing something like, what did you feel about that? How did that come together for you?
So, there's a certain unguarded appeal to reading other people's mail, and which is really what this book is sort of based on, is reading people's private mail. So there's a little bit of a guilty pleasure to that. And I imagine if the soldiers were still alive, they would be aghast that their personal letters were being read. And often soldiers would burn the letters that they received from home after, really digesting them. And one of their biggest fears was being wounded or killed on the battlefield, and some Confederate, see a picture of his sweetheart or letters that were written to him. I mean, this was something that was strictly private. And so that was one of the best ways to protect privacy, was to actually burn the letters that you received from home. But after a while, especially if you're an enlisted soldier, you had to carry everything with you. So, a bundle of letters would, be a little bit of a logistical burden. Some of them sent them express back home because they wanted to keep them, but a lot of them didn't. The letters back then were not censored as well. If they were intercepted by the Confederates would open it, but they would be looking for money. They're not going to be looking for military intelligence from soldiers' letters. You could get better military intelligence from the local newspapers.
Yeah, the newspapers, right?
Quite honestly. Also, when you read letters, if you think of it this way, they're kind of like ersatz oral history. It's like if I got into a Wayback Machine, showed up at a soldier's tent, and said, "Hey, soldier, what's on your mind today, and what would you like to say to the people back home about that?" And I said, "Oh, well, I think, oh, no, just write it down. That'll be fine. I got to go into the tent next door and ask them the same question." And so those letters are exactly what they're thinking, what's on their mind, that they want to share with the folks, their friends, family back home. So you're right. It's very unguarded, and it's very honest. The only letters that were censored were prisoner of war letters. Those were definitely censored, and some of those are very bland. I'm fine, whether that's true or not. So-and-so is here. I think you know that. I hope you guys are doing well, and so on. And plus they were limited to one piece of paper kind of thing. So you don't get a lot out of those. So I do have a chapter in the book on prisoner of war experiences. I mean, any, complete Army's experience would be incomplete without prisoner of war experiences. So for that, I made a partial exception on soldiers' remembrances. And when they talk about the various prisoner of war camps, Belle Isle, Andersonville, and so on, you often see a lot of convergence in what they say. or what they write about regarding that. So I made that exception because I wanted the readers to understand that this was also part of the soldier experience during the Civil War.
Did a favorite soldier or a particularly memorable collection kind of emerge from you out of the hundreds, if not thousands, of collections that you considered from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library? And if so, could you share one or two with us that really stood out for you?
So, Doug, I get this question a lot, and my answer is always the same. No, I don't have a favorite. In fact, the 165 favorites are in the book. Because I sort of, so my background is, my degrees are in anthropology. So I have sort of a social science background, and I sort of approach this as informants, if you will. And I was looking for people that were expressive or had good ways of explaining things. Sometimes even if they didn't, sometimes the people that were phonetic spellers were some of the most interesting because you could almost hear their voices. And when I do presentations, when it's not a pandemic, or sometimes even during Zoom, I have people that are attending read the quotations, because my voice certainly cannot represent more than one soldier's actual voice. So I get as many people as possible. And especially women, because they were the ones who would have been reading these aloud at home for the benefit of family and friends and so on. So it's always a great experience. But the phonetic spellers, you can start to kind of hear their voice because they kind of talk. I mean, they kind of write how they talk. So that's part of the experience. Now, you as a reader of the book, you're more than free to pick your favorites. So I did a presentation a few months ago that was on C-SPAN, and this was with Mark Depew, the oral historian. And he said, when we do this, he said, I'm going to pick some quotations that we can have, and you pick some quotations. And the ones he picked, I would not necessarily have picked, and I understand exactly why he picked some of those. So we would have somebody pre-recorded reading those quotations, and then I said, Mark, I need to offer a counterpoint on that, on what else you should know. That's, I understand why you like it, but here's why it's unusual, or what else you should know about it.
Okay. I think too, one of the things that I've seen, in considering our own obviously much smaller collection of letters that we have here than at the Illinois State Historical Library or the Presidential Library, is you get a real sense of not only the soldier and his family, but because these men often enlisted out of the same community together, they would be giving a lot of information about neighbors or other people who lived in that small community. So not only are you getting the flavor of what's going on in maybe that household, but you maybe get a real sense of what's going on in that entire community, because the soldier is commenting on friends of his or other acquaintances or people that the reader would also know, like saw John Smith, in camp, or he's out sick, or you wouldn't believe what this guy did the other day, or something like that. I always find that that's really interesting, that you not only get the look of the individual and the family unit, but you also get a really neat look at the community. Did you find that as well?
Yes, absolutely. And you get some where they say, so-and-so has been doing X, Y, Z, and it might be something that's a little shady. But sometimes they'll say that because they want to sort of preempt, yeah, I know what's going on and so on, but I'm not doing that. But maybe some other people are, but oh no, I'm not partaking in any of that sort of thing. I gave my spouse or significant other, my family, a vow that I would try and stay away from drink, or I wouldn't do this, or I wouldn't do that, sort of thing. So sometimes there's sort of that in there too. But yeah, you do get the kind of community feel. So soldiers would write about their combat experiences, but that was not a common thing. More commonly, they would write after, say the Battle of Chattanooga, they would write as soon as they could back home and say, I'm okay. William that you know, Jacob and so on are okay or not okay, kind of thing. But in terms of how the battle went, oh, you can read all the particulars in the newspaper, because you have to remember soldiers, especially enlisted men, just know their area of what kind of went on. They actually learn some of what went on in the battle, not only talking with other soldiers, but what's reading in the newspapers. And they were soldiers in general, both Confederates and on the federal side were interested in reading and newspapers. And the universal signal for having a parley or truce among pickets was to wave a newspaper, to get together to see what they might be able to trade.
It's great. Well, Mark, I want to thank you for spending this time with us today. Can you hold up the book again for everybody so that they can get the title? And
Sure.
in their letters, in their words, Illinois Civil War Soldiers Write Home. We
Yeah.
certainly recommend it. And I'm going to recommend it to our museum store here at the museum. And Mark, we look forward to hopefully very soon doing more in-person things like this. And I found what you said about having people read the excerpts from the crowd is a great way to get people participating in the lecture. And so I look forward to inviting you to come to Kenosha to see the museum, but then so that also that our audience can get to know you as well and to get to know the book and participate in that lecture. I think that'd be a lot of fun.
Oh, I would really relish that. I'd look forward to that. Doug, if you don't mind, let me mention one thing for people
Sure.
to go find more about the book. The web address is Mark Flotow, and here's again how to spell it, .net, N-E-T. The website is not about me. It was just an available domain name. There's not that many Mark Flotows out there, but there are some others. But it's really just about the book.
Yeah, and I've been looking at the website and in prepping for our discussion today, and for those of you out there is a tremendous amount of information that Mark has broken down for you. You have a question of the week section that is on one of the tabs at the top of the site, and Mark really goes into great detail answering questions that either he's received as he's done programs like this or things he's gotten emailed to him. We were talking about muster-in points for Illinois soldiers.
Yes.
You know, Mark has done a tremendous amount of work with newspapers in the Springfield area. So it is a tremendous resource to learn about the experiences of Illinois soldiers during the Civil War. So I highly recommend it to any of you who are out there to check that out. Click on that section. You will find a tremendous treasure trove of primary source information, not only from letter collections, but also from the work that Mark is doing with local Springfield newspapers as well.
Yeah, and the other thing is that you put something in a book and that's it. That's all there's going to be there. And I realized when I was writing the book, not everything could fit in. And I immediately, well before the book was completed, I need a website so that I can show the full quotation or the bigger context or soldiers that I've read since then. So it's sort of makes the book more of a living document in that regard.
And it's a really cool way, I think, to interact with you as the author too. So it's a real neat opportunity. So thank you so much, Mark. We look forward to getting you up here to Kenosha sometime in the very near future. And take care and all the best with the book.
Okay. Thank you so much, Doug. I appreciate being on your program.
All right. Take care. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.